You said that you had one relapse.
So it's not called relapsing in this community. We don't use the R word, the R slur, Megan. I literally could not conceptualize life being better without alcohol. It's like thinking of life without a smartphone, like impossible at this point. Alcohol addiction affects something like 10% of Americans. It's a massive population, and a small, very small percentage of those will actually be prescribed any medication for their drinking.
Why hasn't this become more common knowledge?
I promise you, like I'm not in the pocket of big naltrexone. I'm not being paid by whoever makes these drugs. I actually don't even know who makes the drugs at this point. I guess the other alternative was to not quit and to eventually die. I could have done that. I have the solution to the loneliness crisis, and that's to bring back smoking.
Like a lot of you, I enjoy a good drink. In fact, I enjoy a lot of them because my husband actually runs a newsletter for home bartenders. So most evenings after work is over, I get to kick back with a handmade craft cocktail made for me by an expert. But I usually just have one, and not everyone can stop at one. For some people, a combination of genetics and environment makes them crave more and more and more. Once they take that first drink, they can't stop until alcohol takes over their life, and it does an incredible amount of damage. The World Health Organization estimates that in 2019, alcohol killed 2.6 million people from a combination of reckless behavior and crime, where alcohol is often implicated, and the toxic effects of too much alcohol on your own body. That's why for decades, the received wisdom has been that alcoholics just need to swear off the stuff. Don't take that first drink and you can't take the next one. So that's the message of AA, and that formula, don't touch alcohol, work the steps, stay sober one day at a time. It's worked for millions of people. It's saved an untold number of lives, but it doesn't work for everyone. The problem is the prospect of never having another drink again, it deters a lot of people from even trying to quit. That's why I'm so excited about today's guest, Katie Herzog. Full disclosure, I know Katie in real life. She also co-hosts one of my favorite podcasts, Blocked and Reported, which explores some of the more outre corners of the internet. But what I didn't know until recently was that Katie had a drinking problem. She's one of those people who couldn't stop drinking once she started, and she also found AA just didn't work for her. Fortunately, Katie's a good journalist, and she did some research and found out that science has actually given us other ways to combat alcohol usage disorder. So now she's written a book, Drink Your Way Sober, about her experiences, and about how, through the wonders of modern medicine, many people with alcohol use disorder can control their drinking without having to leap headfirst into abstinence. I think it's a really important message for Dry January, but more importantly, for anyone who's looking at their own drinking, thinking it's too much, and trying to figure out how to turn their life around for the new year. Katie Herzog, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So I actually just want to, let's start, take me through your story. Where'd you grow up? When did you have your first drink? And how did you like it?
Yeah, so I'm from Western North Carolina, the part of the country that was made famous. Nobody had heard of it until, actually, there was a brief period in the 90s when, do you remember Eric Robert Rudolph?
I do. I do remember that.
So he was the Olympic park bomber from the 90s, and he hid out in the mountains of North Carolina. That's where I'm from. So this is an area very
rural. Did not meet him yourself, I assume.
I didn't meet him, but I did have a t-shirt, like many of my peers, that said Eric Robert Rudolph, hide and seek champion of 1996 or whatever it was. These were very common. So that's where I grew up. I grew up in a rural area, sort of in the woods, in the mountains of Western North Carolina, and people drank. So I grew up in a dry county, so it was a little bit harder than it is today to actually procure alcohol. But that did not deter me and my fellow children, really. We were children at the time. So I had my first drink when I was in middle school. So I would have been 12 or 13 years old. And from the very beginning, I liked it. I really found that alcohol suited me. I'm a bit shy, and alcohol really, it opened me up. Made me more entertaining, more importantly, made everybody else more entertaining. And so I drank, a few times in middle school, more than any 12-year-old should, for sure. And then I drank a lot in high school and a whole lot in college. And then by the time college was over, I was a barfly. So when I was 21, 22 years old, I was a regular at bars in my town, and I'd be there oftentimes with out of work men at 4 p.m. Drinking the day away. And I loved it. I loved it a lot. It just unfortunately is long term not the best habit.
Yeah, I started drinking in high school, way too young. And I drank pretty heavily in college. And I would definitely go out and have too many drinks into my 30s until my body finally was like, no, we're old now. We can't do that anymore.
Yeah.
But my vice was smoking. And,
Yes.
most people, when they try it, they find it disgusting the first time. I was like, oh my God, this is the best.
Yes.
And this is like clearly genetic. And because my mother was a heavy smoker and ultimately died of chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. And also, I once asked her how she managed to quit smoking when she was pregnant with me. And she was like, oh, it was easy. I didn't. So I might also have had some prenatal exposure. But yeah, it's sort of a bad sign for addiction when the first time you do something like that, you're like, this is amazing. I never want to stop.
And smoking and drinking are so intertwined, less so today. I do actually think that I have the solution to the loneliness crisis, and that's to bring back smoking. You go outside, you ask to borrow a lighter from someone. Really, you have a lighter in your pocket. Maybe this is just my experience. It's about small talk. It's about meeting people. I think we need to bring that back.
I will think about it, but as someone who really, really struggled to quit, I'm not sure I want to get back on that bandwagon.
You got to do it for the people.
Fair enough. But okay, so like, how would you describe your drinking trajectory, right? How long did it take you to ramp up to the point where you felt like you were drinking too much?
It took like 12 years to realize that I had a problem. And my first realization that I had a problem was in my early 20s. And at that moment, I had a crisis. Basically, the short version of the story is that the relationship I was in at the time was ending due to alcohol. And I think it took a crisis rather than just sort of looking around and being like, I'm surrounded by empty bottles. This is a problem, because everybody that I knew drank a lot. So my drinking was not abnormal for the milieu that I was in.
And did your girlfriend drink a lot?
She was in law school at the time, so not like I did. Like, I worked at coffee shops. She was in law school. So we had a very different, she was busy. So while she was at school, I was drinking. I would go to work in the morning and then I would go straight to a bar. So I was sort of drinking early, sort of day drinking quite often. And then by the time that she got home from school, I had sort of cleaned my act up. So she was not aware of the extent of my drinking. And as you read in the book, this would become a theme in my life.
That strikes me as really important, because I think that drinking can be a problem even if you're maintaining well enough. And like you said in the book, you lost jobs, you lost relationships, but you were also maintaining well enough to get a good job as a journalist, to get married, and to have a beautiful golden doodle.
Thank you.
And a pretty successful podcast. So it's not that you were just in this endless downward spiral. It's just that you were drinking in ways that you felt were making your life bad.
Yeah. So my drinking, it came in waves. So in my early 20s, really heavy drinking. Mid 20s, also really heavy. Late 20s, again, really heavy. And then in my 30s, early 30s, that's when I started to get more serious about having a career. And at that point, I was able to limit my drinking to the weekends. So I was basically serious, Monday through Friday or Monday through Thursday. And then I would binge on the weekends. And I was able to maintain that for a long time, and to in my career, I didn't skyrocket. I'm not Megan McArdle of the Washington Post, but I did manage to hold jobs. I also got, it's journalism. I also got laid off a few times. But I did manage to sort of eke a living out of this business.
I feel like you're not really a journalist unless you've been laid off.
Just laid off
at this point. But
seriously.
But so talk to me about why you wanted to quit and when you started wanting to quit.
So I wanted to quit for a long time, and I tried to quit many, many times. So at that first realization in my early 20s, when I was going through this breakup, that was my first attempt at quitting. I went to AA, Didn't take. I did not like it. And there were many attempts throughout
Did
the
you try
next.
working the steps?
No, not really. Not really. I went to meetings, but I didn't get a sponsor. I didn't talk in the meetings. I felt resentful of being there. I didn't like the people. I thought when people in meetings would talk about how much better their lives were sober, I thought they were lying. I literally could not conceptualize life being better without alcohol. It's like thinking of life without a smartphone, like impossible at this point. And so I tried to quit a lot. I did individual therapy, I did outpatient group therapy. I did the master cleanse at one point where you like don't eat for, 10 days. I didn't make it 10 days, but I would do sort of wacky stuff like that. A lot of yoga.
Wow.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, I quit doing the master cleanse because I wanted to drink. Like my first calories after that were not a salad. And then, in my 30s, I got more serious about my career. I got good jobs, and alcohol was not that much of a barrier to my success, whatever small amount of success that I've had. It was really COVID.
Katie, like I am now
Thank
interrupting to
you.
tell my listeners that Katie runs this
Like and
amazing
subscribe.
podcast, which you heard about in the intro, but that just explores all of the dark corners of the internet and is fantastic and is one of my must listens and also the must listen of a lot of other people every week. So
Thank you, Megan. Well, so the podcast was, we started the podcast during COVID, and that was really when my drinking ramped up to being problematic again. So it had been very problematic in my 20s, less so in my 30s, and then during COVID, that's when it got to be bad because so I had been before COVID, I had been a staff writer at The Stranger, which is Seattle's alt weekly. I got laid off during COVID, and I started the podcast. But the podcast at that point, like now it's a job that I spend a lot of time on. It's basically a full-time job, but at the beginning it really wasn't. At the beginning it was just sort of, two bros shooting the shit on the mic, and we didn't do very much prep, and there was also so much happening in the culture just to talk about that it was
right.
really a pretty part-time job. So I spent most of my time like scrolling on my phone during COVID. My wife is a nurse, and so she was gone. And at some point, like very early on in COVID, I just started day drinking, and I did it a lot. And I did it to a point where I developed this obsession, and it was an obsession that I was familiar with because I had experienced that same obsession in my 20s and in my early 30s when my drinking was at its worst, where I compare it to, for people who haven't experienced this, I think the closest sort of corollary would be, uh, the experience of having a crush on someone or new love when all you can think about is that person. And you might be going about your day and, like, having conversations and going to work and going to the grocery store, but in the back of your mind, you're always wondering, "Is she gonna text me? Is he gonna," it's that sort of obsession. It was just mentally exhausting and overwhelming, and that's what alcohol addiction was for me. It was a compulsion, an obsession. It was mental as much as it was physical, and it really started to take over my life.
So eventually you decided to stop. Was there anything that really made you think like, this is it? I can't go on like this.
Yeah, so I should mention I was doing this in secret. So my wife was, at the hospital doing saving lives, whatever nurses do during COVID, blah, blah, blah. And I was at home drinking. And when she would come home from work, not that much different from what I had done 15 years earlier with my first girlfriend in law school, I would drink during the day. And then a few hours before she got home, I would clean myself up, clean the house, put on a sober face, and act sober. And I did this for like 2 years during COVID, and she never had any idea. And I knew that this was going to kill me, not just because of physically I looked terrible, like everybody gained weight on during COVID. Mine was all alcohol weight. I was waking up at 3 o'clock, 3:30 every morning, just racked with guilt, night sweats. I felt terrible. Mentally, I was mentally just kind of destroyed. And because I had been there before, I knew that there was sort of one path out of this, and that path was to quit. But I still couldn't conceptualize my life without alcohol. Or I guess the other alternative was to not quit and to eventually die. I could have done that. Um, And so I did, I did the things that people do. So first I did some Zoom meetings, AA meetings, that didn't really take. I couldn't, I had been to AA plenty of times in the past, and the meetings in person, at least that gave you a place to go, but this was like I was at my house, it was on Zoom, it wasn't compelling. It was too I could keep a can of beer behind my camera and nobody would know. I called Hazelden Betty Ford, one of the biggest rehab in the country. I got an estimate for how much it would cost for me to go to rehab. It was gonna be, I think, $27,000. It would have been extremely disruptive. I had this podcast. You can't podcast from rehab. I think that's like the second rule after no alcohol is no podcast. So it didn't fit my life. It didn't fit my lifestyle. And so I looked for a third option. And so the alternative that I found was called the Sinclair Method. And I had learned about this a few years before in an article that I'd read in The Atlantic. The article was by a woman named Gabrielle Glasser. And the article was called The Irrationality of Alcoholics Anonymous. And so most of the article was about that. It was about sort of the recidivism rates of AA and why AA isn't more effective for more people. And I should say, AA is very effective for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Keith
It's not an
Humphreys.
anti-AA.
No, it's not an anti-AA book. I'm not anti-AA. AA has saved many, many people's lives, including people I care about. AA just didn't work for me. But the article was about that. And there was this passage in the article about an alternate treatment. And Gabrielle Glasser had gone to Finland, where it had been popularized. And she met the guy who developed this protocol. His name is John David Sinclair. And he was an American researcher who spent most of his life working in Finland. And he basically, in his early studies, he gave lab rats different drugs to block the pleasurable effects of alcohol. One of those is an endorphin blocker, an opioid blocker called naltrexone. Naltrexone is a cheap, easy to procure drug. It was developed in the 1960s. It's been generic for decades, so very inexpensive drug. And Dr. Sinclair found that if he gave lab rats who had been specifically bred to enjoy a drink, not every once in a while, but quite often,
which they don't normally, right? You have to really force them to drink alcohol.
You have to find the ones with that look in their eye, and then you put them in a dark room together and see what happens. So he had these rats.
Mood music.
Yes, some tequila.
Some cheese snacks.
Yes. D'Angelo on the speaker. So he had this line of rats. They were called AA rats, not for Alcoholics Anonymous, but they were called AA rats. And he gave them this opioid blocker, naltrexone. And he found that if they were given the opportunity to drink after taking naltrexone, they wouldn't take it. They had lost the taste for alcohol. And what he also found, something else important, which was that it was the alcohol itself that was the key ingredient to this. So it wasn't just take the opioid blocker and don't drink. It was take the opioid blocker and drink. And after a period of time, repeated exposure, when rats were no longer getting pleasure from alcohol, they stopped drinking on their own. They just lost the desire to drink. And so then he started doing some early human studies. Other researchers later took up his work and did similar human trials. And out of this came what is now called the Sinclair Method, which is this very sort of deceptively simple protocol. But basically it's this: take an opioid blocker, usually naltrexone, you wait an hour, and then you drink as normal. And this diminishes the pleasure that you get from alcohol. And if you do this every time that you drink, the idea is that eventually you will reach what's called extinction, which is basically a state of unlearning. So you unlearn the connection the association between alcohol and pleasure.
So I want to take this back one step and talk about the science of what's happening in your brain, right? Because most people who are heavy drinkers stop on their own. You drink a lot in college, you hit your 20s, life gets busier, and you just don't have time. Or you hit your early 30s and your hangovers get worse, and you just think, I don't really want to do that. The last hangover I had was after I reached in my 30s the wonderful experience of being able to go straight to the hangover and missing the drunk entirely.
Yeah.
And the last hangover I had, I think I was close to 40. I'd gone to a party and had just two drinks. albeit there was supposed to be food there and there wasn't. So I did this on an empty stomach, and I woke up the next day. I had the shakes, and then I got an entire pitcher of lemonade, which my dog promptly knocked over on my laptop, destroying the laptop. And I was telling the story to my mother, and I was like, Mom, you're not going to believe me. I swear to God, 2 drinks over the course of like 2 hours.
Yeah.
She said, oh, no, I believe you. It happens to everyone in the family when you're near 40. You can't drink anymore.
Yeah.
But most people reach a point like that where and then alcoholics or people with alcohol use disorder or problem drinkers or whatever you want to call it, they don't reach that point. So what's happening in their brain that is different?
Well, I think a lot do reach that point. They just drink through it. So this idea, this is sort of not something that's well known, but you're exactly right when you say that most heavy drinkers just quit drinking on their own. This is called natural recovery. It is incredibly common. So if you think back on, your crew in college, my crew in college, everyone drank as much as I did in college. I'm probably not the only one, but one of the only ones who developed a, multi-decade crippling alcohol addiction, because everybody else, went and got jobs or they got kids. They just did these life things that made drinking less fun or impractical or whatever. And so they just quit on their own, just spontaneously quit, or they just cut back to a reasonable level. That's what most people do. I don't think we currently know exactly why some people are unable to do that. So we know that there's a few risk factors when it comes to developing what's now called alcohol use disorder. Alcoholism is the term everybody knows. And there's the things that you would expect, like trauma, adverse childhood experiences. Genetics. So if you come from a long line of alcoholics, you're much more likely to have a drinking problem on your own. There's also 2 other risk factors that I didn't have any trauma in my background. I might be the only person without trauma.
There were some moments in 3rd grade.
Yeah.
I still remember very painfully.
I'm a trauma denier. So no trauma, but I do come from, not my immediate family, but there's a lot of alcoholism in my extended family. I come from a big Irish Catholic family, probably not surprising.
Yeah, me too. I have a few of them.
Yeah. And another risk factor is exposure. So just if you could have all of the risk factors, but if you never start drinking, you're not going to develop a drinking problem.
Mormons, very low drinking problems.
Mormons, yes. And then another risk factor is age of exposure. So I had those 3 risk factors, right? I started drinking really young, I drank a lot, and I have a genetic predisposition towards alcoholism. In terms of what is going on physiologically, I don't think anybody quite knows at this point. I would guess, and I am guessing here, that just from, I'm married to a woman who I think I've never seen her have more than 2 drinks in one setting. I don't think that she has the same experience when she drinks that I do. When I drink, I get energized. I get high. I get not just sort of drunk, I get buzzed, if that makes any sense, right? It's almost like drinking a little bit of caffeine, a little bit of cocaine. For people like me tend to be binge drinkers because your experience of drinking is super, super pleasurable. And so my guess is that people who don't have that, maybe they have fewer opioid receptors in the brain or something like that. They're just not having that same physiological experience.
Yeah, I've thought that with food as well. That is clear to me long before, we got Ozempic and sort of started to understand that this really is just, there is something happening in your body. It's not about being of poor character or lazy or not having good willpower. But that people who have weight problems, like serious weight problems, I'm not saying I couldn't afford to lose 5 pounds, but that they're having a different experience with food than I am. And I've talked to a lot of people who are struggling to lose weight, and the things they say, and similarly with nicotine, most people don't get addicted to it. But I know if I have 1 cigarette, I will have a pack and a half a day habit within a very short period of time because I can't get enough of it. I love it. And it's just obviously more rewarding for me than it is for other people. And I think drinking clearly seems like in some way it is more rewarding for people who go on to develop problems than it is for people who don't.
I think that's exactly it. It's more rewarding. And it's not as though the consequences are less. Clinicians don't like the term hijacked in general, but I think it's as a sort of metaphor, that's kind of what it feels like. It feels like your brain has been hijacked, and that is the addiction running your brain rather than your brain running your brain.
Right. So what does AA, let's start with the traditional method, which is what does AA do to break that cycle?
I think the value in AA is that it gives you a place to go, right? So if you are a heavy drinker and your community is heavy drinkers, or you have lost your community because your whole life revolves around alcohol, it breaks that cycle by giving you a place to go that's sober. So that's just the first step. There's also other factors like accountability, friendship. I think that's huge. Community.
You don't want to let them down by relapsing.
Right. And let yourself down. And there's also the spiritual aspect, which ends up being very important to a lot of people. And AA also, this is something that the Sinclair Method doesn't really do. But AA, for a lot of people, it shifts your identity. It shifts your sense of who you are from being a drinker to being a sober person. And for a lot of people, that's incredibly valuable. Maybe even, the sense of community. Maybe addicts in particular need that more. I am an outlier in the sense that I don't need that. It's not as though I don't need like any human interaction. I for sure do, but I'm not a joiner. And so, for me to go to what is oftentimes a very public therapy session is humiliating. And I see the value in it. I for sure do.
Bad at therapy, just generally.
Oh, yeah.
I sympathize.
Yes.
So like that public group therapy, was that part of the reason that AA was hard for you, or was it also about the fact that you would have to stop?
I mean, I think it was mostly about the fact that I would have to stop. And I did other I did abstinence-based but non-AA group therapies, and I found those a little bit more entertaining. Like one that I went to was primarily, I'm not quite sure how I ended up in this group, but there were a lot of people who had just come out of prison and they had incredible stories. So I always appreciated that aspect of AA. AA has some really fantastic storytellers. But yes, the sort of public purging, I found that difficult, which is why it's sort of ironic that I wrote a self-help book and now I'm actually talking to people about my problems all the time. But in general, I don't enjoy that. I don't like to talk about my problems publicly or privately.
So now I want to talk about what happens in the brain when you do the Sinclair Method. You've talked a bit about that, about how it hits that reward system. It just makes it less rewarding. And that but that idea, right, of drinking, of having to drink, that's been hugely controversial among the addiction community, right?
Yes, because AA was founded in the 1930s, so we're talking almost 100 years at this point, 90 years about, of having AA be the dominant paradigm for how people get sober today. And AA is obviously based on abstinence. And I should say, AA itself, like if you read the big book is the Bible of AA. And the authors of the big book, one of whom, the most important author, was one of the founders of AA. His name was Bill Wilson. This guy was incredibly open-minded. One of the first sentences in the big book is something like, science may one day find that there is a cure for alcoholism, but it hasn't yet. There's another sentence in the big book about how AA doesn't have a monopoly on therapies. So AA itself, if you read the doctrine, they literally make no claims that this is the only solution forward. And yet that message is frequently pushed by AA groups, and all meetings are different, of course. But I think culturally, I at least absorbed the idea that the only way out of addiction was abstinence. And the problem with that is, well, for one thing, it's not true. But another problem is that if people think that that's true, that the only way out of their addiction, the only way out of problem drinking is never drinking again, that is such a barrier, emotional barrier, physical barrier, cognitive barrier, that some people just aren't going to do it. Because if the options are never have a drink again, they say it's one day at a time, but everybody knows never again, or just keep doing what you're doing, a lot of people are just going to keep doing what they're doing. And that's what I did for years because I thought there was only one option.
Or they're going to wait until they need a liver transplant,
Yes.
or they're going to wait,
Yes.
right?
A DUI.
Yeah, it's got to be so dire that it's worth giving up drinking
Right.
for. But
Which rarely works, you know? I mean, and I had that sort of magical thinking all the time. I'll go to a doctor, I'll find out my liver's shot, and that'll be the thing. You know, I'll lose one more job, I'll lose one more relationship, I'll lose my housing one more time, and that'll be the thing. And it never was.
so you go and you get these pills, but you actually don't, you had them in your drawer for a while, right?
Yeah,
So tell
yeah.
me about that. Tell me about your experience. You decide during the pandemic, this is it. I have to stop.
So to back up a little bit, I had learned about the Sinclair Method several years before the pandemic. I went and got a prescription for naltrexone. My doctor had never heard of the Sinclair Method. I printed out the Atlantic article that I told you about. I brought it to her. She was happy to prescribe this drug. So I went home. On the way home, you know, I stopped and got a tall boy of Rainier, whatever beer I was drinking at the time, took the pill, waited an hour, and I just felt awful. I had bad side effects like nausea, headachy. I felt depressed, and I had been fairly optimistic, like, this is the thing that I've been looking for. And then when I felt bad, I was like, okay, this isn't the thing I'm looking for. So I just put it in a drawer and just forgot about it until the pandemic. And then, you know, I didn't have one rock bottom during the pandemic. I had a couple of like slightly like other people think these are humiliating. I'm like, the humiliating stuff didn't end up in the book. One of those examples would be I was one night, I was asleep in bed and I got up and I walked into my bathroom to go pee. The door was closed. I like hit the bathroom door with my head, like walked right into it, turned around, walked outside, and dropped my shorts and peed in my backyard. I only know this because my wife saw this. And so she came outside, she followed me outside, and she shook me, and I sort of came to, what is going on? What am I doing? So that was that wasn't rock bottom. I don't think anybody saw me. It was kind of funny, but I did have some experiences.
And she thought you were sleepwalking, right?
Yes. Not only was I drinking, I was lying to my spouse about it. I had so much anxiety about being caught. You know, I had all of these rituals of like walking around the house, looking for empty bottles, making sure I hadn't left something. A couple times I I actually did leave incriminating evidence and had to really think fast on my feet to get out of those sticky situations. So I was really unhappy. I was anxious, I was depressed, I felt like shit. And I didn't want to live like that anymore. And I knew that, you know, like I said before, I called Hazel and Betty Ford. It was going to be almost $30,000 to go to rehab in Minnesota. Like, and I'm not talking like Passages, Malibu. This is in Minnesota. There wasn't going to be a good view or like a beach suite. There probably wasn't even going to be a private chef or yoga. No horseback riding. You know, it was going to be AA meetings. And I didn't want to do that. But I had this prescription for naltrexone in my closet somewhere. And so I thought, okay, I'm just going to try this one more time. And if it works, awesome. And if it doesn't, I'm going to have to fess up and come clean. And I'm going to have to go to Minnesota, or at least AA.
So was it just as simple as taking a pill and waiting an hour?
So that is the protocol. Take it naltrexone, wait an hour, and then drink as normal. There are all sorts of other things that are sort of best practices for how to successfully wean yourself off of alcohol using this protocol. Or for some people don't want to get sober. Some people want to just drink moderately. So they want to take the pill and go drink, have one glass of wine and not the whole bottle. A lot of people go into this with that goal in mind. They don't want to quit. I wanted to quit. I've never seen the point of a glass of wine or one beer, has never appealed to me. So for me, I wanted to come out of this process sober. So there's small things to do, right? Like dealing with side effects. That was something I had to learn. And
because you had side effects from naltrexone,
yes,
consistently, right?
Yes. And so one of the interesting things about this drug or this protocol is that at the time, this is not as true now. Now there are telehealth providers that specialize in this. But at the time I was doing this, if you wanted to get good information about the Sinclair Method, the place to turn was Facebook. And there are very few health-related things I would advise people to take Facebook's recommendation over their doctors. I'm not an ivermectin bro. But this was a case where there were a lot of Facebook groups, or a number of Facebook groups where people share their experiences. So I spent a lot of time reading these posts and talking to people in the groups and interviewing people because I'm a reporter. So if I wanted to know what to do, I would just call somebody up and ask them. I also talked to clinicians, I talked to therapists. So I really did a lot of research. And so I was well prepared the second time around. So for instance, side effects. Not everybody gets them. This is really important. I think a minority of people actually get side effects, and they tend to be pretty minor for people who do get them. So there are really pretty simple things you can do to minimize side effects if you do have them. And or the hypothetical you. I'm not giving medical advice. Don't sue me. But things like having a full meal before you take your pill, drinking with a full glass of water. Some people take drugs like Zofran, like these prescription anti-nausea medications, microdosing. And again, most people don't get side effects. So this is not, don't let that deter you if you're interested in this, but I did.
This is a little bit like Ozempic. It's like something else, except it's extremely cheap. This is one of the things that I was a little surprised by, right? How much does a month's supply of naltrexone cost?
Well, it depends on your insurance and copays, but it's generic. So for me, I think at the time my copay was $30 for 30 pills, and I didn't drink it. I was splitting them up. So that lasted me a long time. I've certainly less than 1 day of drinking. And people in the Sinclair Method world like to say that the pill is half the process. I would say the pill is like 70% of the process. But one of the other key sort of behavioral changes in this process is incorporating alcohol-free days into your week. And it takes some people a really long time to have an alcohol-free day. Like I know people who it has taken them years on the Sinclair Method to have an alcohol-free day. And on alcohol-free days, according to the Sinclair Method, you don't take naltrexone. And the reason that's important is because the naltrexone targets this specific behavior. You don't want to take naltrexone when you're not drinking.
To go back to these opioid receptors in your brain, right? They don't just reward you for alcohol.
No.
They reward you for everything.
Yes. So yes. Are you thinking about sex right now?
Actually, I was thinking about cigarettes, but I mean, which do go together.
Very similar.
But they reward you for like petting your dog, right?
Yes.
They reward you for all sorts of things that you do. And so when you block it, you're kind of dampening the effect a little bit, which is why, there are people who take it every day.
Yes.
And just consistently do it. In the Sinclair Method, the idea is to make this particular behavior less rewarding.
Exactly.
But other behaviors like going for walks in the woods and, candlelit spa baths, to make those things more rewarding for you to kind of both sides of the behavioral equation.
Right. So on alcohol-free days, the idea is that you do those things. You take the bath, the candlelit bath, you go for the walk in the woods, you exercise, you have sex, you have a good meal with your family, whatever it is. The idea is that this sort of heightens the pleasure. You're basically trying to relearn behaviors or rewire your brain. I never found that like taking a walk in the woods off naltrexone was like, oh my God, this is amazing. But I did find that naltrexone itself, on the days when I took naltrexone, I definitely felt duller and more, just not as good. And for me, it was actually good because I didn't like taking naltrexone. And so it got to the point where if I wasn't enjoying the alcohol and I wasn't enjoying the feeling of taking the naltrexone, I didn't want to drink. It just wasn't worth it. Like the trade-offs, it was as though the part of my brain that was able to conceptualize trade-offs, the libertarian part of my brain, had turned back on. And I was rational again. So yeah, that is part of it. Alcohol-free days, very key. And as you mentioned, some people do take naltrexone every day. That's how it's often prescribed. I don't think that would have worked for me because I didn't like the way it made me feel.
And the flip side of this is that it's really important not to drink without the naltrexone, right? And you said that you had one relapse fairly early on in the process.
Yeah. So it's not called relapsing in this community. We don't use the R word, the R slur, Megan. It's called drinking non-compliantly. And I did that as like a small handful of times over the process of doing naltrexone. It didn't destroy the process for me. I didn't like go back to step 1, but the idea is that if you consistently are, or if you're inconsistently taking the drug, then your brain is going to get these messages that, oh, sometimes I can still get high from this. I can still get this reward, and you're going to continue to crave it.
Right. And so one of the really interesting things that I learned from this book is that you get to is that like you think of alcohol, and I think probably for normal drinkers this is true, that the less you drink, the less you will crave it. But that's not really how it works for people who have a strong drive to drink. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so this is one thing that John David Sinclair realized in his early alcohol studies. So he was an undergraduate when he was doing these studies on lab rats. He realized that if these lab rats who had been bred to enjoy the taste of alcohol, alcoholic rats, if they were given a period of enforced abstinence, you might think, oh, after you haven't had a drink for a while, you'll lose the taste of it. He actually found that wasn't the case. What actually happened is that after a period of abstinence, they binged. And that, for people, it's January. For people who are doing dry January, who maybe aren't alcoholics, but just really like to drink, even if it's not dominating their lives, you might be looking forward to February and thinking, I'm going to like February 1st is going to be a good day. And you might drink a little more on February 1st. And that's explained by this idea, the alcohol deprivation effect.
And that's why it's so important to get to extinction, to keep drinking through the opioid antagonists so that you're never setting up a situation where you've got this overwhelming craving and you're going to binge. And it's really interesting because you see that behavior with other stuff, right? You see, like so many people with diets, people who have I think sort of the relationship to food that you had to alcohol is that they do lose weight for a period of time and then it comes back with a vengeance, right? Like, and because the cravings get stronger over time, partly because you are losing weight and your body is more and more anxious about what it doesn't have. And that's how I've always heard that explained. But learning about this made me wonder if that wasn't true with other things as well.
Well, so one thing that I find, there have been studies and a lot of anecdotal reports that GLP-1s like Ozempic, people are drinking less on these drugs. They're eliminating cravings, not just for food. You'll hear people use the term food noise, but also alcohol, gambling, all the fun shit, right? The difference between naltrexone, besides they're very different drugs in different ways. But one of the amazing things, and I sound like I promise you, like I'm not in the pocket of big naltrexone. I'm not being paid by whoever makes these drugs. I actually don't even know who makes the drugs at this point. But naltrexone, if you reach a state of extinction, which is the goal, the unlearning of alcohol and pleasure, it's a state of indifference, basically. When you don't think about alcohol, it doesn't cross your mind, whatever, you can take it or leave it. That doesn't go away when you stop taking naltrexone. If you continue to drink without naltrexone, you would very quickly, those cravings would be reignited. And from what I hear of Ozempic, it's more like that. Once you stop taking the Ozempic, the cravings come back. So for me, I did this for 7 months, and then I decided I was going to take a month off of drinking. And it was easy. And taking a month off of drinking before this was so difficult. I rarely did it, maybe a couple of times in my life, because it was a chore. It was like mentally, emotionally, physically very difficult. And so I didn't do it. After 7 months on the Sinclair Method, it was easy. I didn't think about drinking. It didn't cross my mind. And so after that month came and went, I just never started drinking again. So I don't take naltrexone anymore. If I had a drink today and a drink tomorrow and a drink the next day without naltrexone, I think very quickly, because I have those risk factors, very quickly I would fall into exactly where I was before.
So it took you, would you say you had reached extinction at 7 months?
I think it took me, I declared it at sort of like 8 or 9 months because I needed that period of abstinence. I needed that month off and then 2 months off to say like, oh, I really don't need this anymore. And the difference between before the Sinclair Method, when I took time off of drinking, the booze noise went away, right? It never went away. So I was always thinking about alcohol. Even in periods of sobriety, I was always thinking about drinking. And after the Sinclair Method, I stopped thinking about it. So I wrote a book about it. I do interviews about it. So I think about it in that context, but it like it would no more occur to me to go into my kitchen and open a bottle of wine right now than it would to go to my car and, drink some motor oil out of the engine. It just does not occur to me. It's though I live in a world where alcohol doesn't exist. And it does exist. I'm around it a lot. But for me, it has no emotional pull.
This is maddening to me, not because I want to overthrow AA. It's obviously been great for a lot of people, right? But it just seems like this is a really effective tool in the toolkit for people who have this obsession they want to get free of, and no one knows about it. Or not literally no one, but far too few people know about this. Why is that? Why hasn't this become more common knowledge?
Yeah, so I wish I could tell you that there was a conspiracy, but I don't think there is. I think my book would have sold better if there was a conspiracy that I was,
You should have written like the conspiracy
I
to
should
keep
have.
drinking.
Yes,
That
I
would have
should have.
been the
Big AA. I don't think it's actually that. I think that there's a number of factors. So one factor goes back to the early days of this drug, just the early days it wasn't marketed well. And it's also true that AA has culturally really, it's been a force for good in many ways, but it's had this kind of overwhelming effect on the culture that doctors, lay people, we all sort of have this sense that the only way out of alcohol addiction is sobriety. It's one day at a time. It's go to meetings, go to 90 meetings in 90 days, work the steps. So the success of AA sort of elbowed everything out. Um, Rehabs weren't interested. Until very recently, rehabs were not interested in using medication assisted therapy. That has changed with the opioid crisis. Now you have drugs like Suboxone that are used even in rehabs that a decade or two ago were not interested in using any sort of medication assisted therapy because it was seen as replacing one drug with another, right? And because addiction is so often considered, people say it's a disease, but they sort of consider it a spiritual malady. How can you solve this spiritual problem with a drug?
Yeah, there's a wonderful quote that I thought of a lot when people first started talking about Ozempic, because I've long been of the opinion that, like, obviously obesity is mostly about your genetics and something is happening in your brain, and not very much at all about how much willpower or how good a person you are. That, like, we have this feeling that if it's too easy, it shouldn't be easy for you,
Right.
right? If you have been drinking
Right.
too much, it should be hard and miserable. And I'm not saying that
Exactly.
AA feels this way, but I think the society is, at large, does
No.
feel like it should be as miserable as possible.
I think you're exactly right about that. And alcoholism causes so much pain and suffering, not just for the alcoholic, but for the families, for the culture, for society. I kind of get it. You feel like people should be punished for their sins. The thing is, addiction itself is punishing.
And I actually want to talk a little bit about families, and the larger effects, because I think that's something where what I got from your book was that that's actually a piece of AA that's underappreciated. Right. Once you had done this, you face the same problem every person with an addiction has, which is what do I do with my life now that the thing that was central to it is gone?
Yeah, so I did a few things. Megan, I have a different obsession. His name is Moose. So part of that is finding healthier ways to spend my time. Although I'm not sure that my obsession with my dog is healthy at this point. It is pretty overwhelming. Things like being outside, exercising. I spend a lot more time at work now than I did before, and I'm in the lucky position that I actually do enjoy my work. But another thing that I did was I went back to AA. After I got sober, I moved and I needed to make friends. And, the way I had always made friends in the past was through drinking, was going to a bar. I was very good at it. Like I could walk into a bar, not know anybody, and by the end of the night, I'm friends and or enemies, oftentimes enemies, with everyone in the bar. But without that avenue, without that crutch, I needed something else. So I moved actually back to the town where I went to college, where my addiction really, really bloomed. And I started going to AA meetings. And one thing that I found in those meetings was that I enjoyed them more. I wasn't going through I wasn't going through withdrawal. I wasn't going through the emotional upheaval of new sobriety. I had been sober for a while. I didn't feel in danger of relapse. So I could go and I could enjoy people's stories. And when they talked about their lives being so much better sober, than they were they were drinking, I believed them because I had experienced this as well. But I also there was a lot of desperation in those meetings. So you have people at those meetings who have been going every day, sometimes for 40 years, and they're telling the same stories. But for some people, they would talk about how they've been sober for a month or a year or sometimes longer, and they were still thinking about alcohol all the time. They were not free. They were sober, but they weren't free. And I found that really pretty depressing because it was the antithesis of my experience. Alcohol had been a part of my life and now it wasn't. And I just didn't think about it anymore. And so I don't go to AA anymore. I found that my experience was, I think it was too weird for people in AA. Because I didn't feel like I needed to work the steps. I didn't really need to talk about my problems. I had a problem and I fixed it and then it was over. But I did see, I did develop sort of a new appreciation for the meetings themselves because of the community aspect and the accountability and giving people a place to go. So I'm not still going to AA. I'm mostly walking the dog.
The other thing that was fascinating to me is you did this entire thing in secret. You didn't tell your wife until after you had reached extinction.
Do you think I should tell her?
I would advise it now because
Do you think she's going to hear this?
Out after the incredibly wide reach of the Washington Post podcast broadcast this into the far corners of the land.
I did tell her. I waited until I had been sober for quite a while. I wanted to wait until I had been sober for a year because I wanted to make sure that it would stick. And then a year came and went and I didn't tell her. I eventually did. I'd been going to these AA meetings and we had some family members who were going through severe alcohol related health issues. And I saw so much destruction around me and elsewhere that I felt like I needed to tell her. And then later that I needed to sort of come out and tell the world about this because alcohol's bad, man. I mean, it's great, but it's really bad. And I felt like I found something that could really help a lot of people. And by keeping it a secret, gatekeeping this, as they say, because I sort of didn't want to talk about my own experience, I felt like I was doing something kind of selfish.
So the last question I want to ask about this is just, you say this works for a lot of people. But it doesn't work for everyone. And what are the qualities that make of the people that it will work for and who is less likely to succeed on it?
So this isn't 100% known, but there probably is a genetic component. There have been studies that show that people who lack one specific allele basically have no effect with naltrexone has no effect on them. So, you could get your DNA mapped. That's one avenue. But another way to think about it is that naltrexone works really well for a specific type of drinker. So to generalize, there are two types of drinkers. There are reward drinkers and there are relief drinkers. And I was a reward drinker. So I got that buzz. I got that high. Alcohol made me energized. I was a binge drinker. I was highly sociable. That's the kind of drinker I was, the sort of life of the party drinker. It's very hard to imagine, but yes, I was fun.
I find that incredibly easy to imagine, Katie.
Well, thank you, Megan. And then there are relief drinkers. And relief drinkers tend to drink because they are anxious. Alcohol gives them a sedating effect. So maybe they can't sleep and they drink to sort of be able to get to sleep. And naltrexone tends to work really well on the first type of drinker, the reward drinker, and not at all for the second type of drinker. And it almost turns the first type of drinker into the second type of drinker. So it makes you sort of sedated. You're not getting the pleasure. You're getting sort of the, sort of like meh, sort of blah. So when you think about, what kind of, and it's, to complicate things further, some people are both. Nothing can be simple. But yeah, so there's probably a genetic component there. But if you just evaluate sort of what kind of drinker are you, if you tend to be a binge drinker, tend to be energetic, naltrexone might work.
So worth trying anyway.
Worth trying. That's one thing that really surprised me when I was writing this book, was that I learned a lot about the history of addiction treatment. And in some ways, we're going back to an earlier model. So there used to be many, many different forms of treatment. Some of them were really wacky and didn't work at all. Some of them were wacky and actually worked. And right now, like if you're on Instagram, you might get ads for different apps, behavioral therapy apps. You might get ads for drugs like telehealth providers that deal in things like naltrexone. There are, there's these groups for women who they specifically, it's like how the patriarchy makes you drink. There are all sorts of different modes of recovery. AA is not the only one. And I think right now we're moving into a place where more modes are accepted.
Yeah, it seems like that's been true with Ozempic, where suddenly, we saw it went from the fight between the moralizers and fat acceptance to like, oh, you can actually just take a shot, which is actually like a lot of people, it doesn't work for. They go off it for one reason or another. It's the cost, it's the side effects. But I think even if you're not on it, it has changed the conversation around weight in a way that feels really productive. And do you think that that is happening now in alcohol and abuse addiction?
I think it is slowly moving in the right direction. So we can see surveys on how many people are prescribed any type of medication-assisted therapy for alcohol addiction. And it is still under like 5%. And alcohol addiction affects something like 10% of Americans. It's a massive population, and a small, very small percentage of those will actually be prescribed any medication for their drinking. The last time I looked, it was in the 2%. It might have risen up to somewhere closer to 5 in the last year or so. I think probably not though. But it has risen. It has risen for sure, incrementally. The first drugs that were FDA approved for alcohol use disorder are now at this point 70 years old. Antabuse was FDA approved in the 1950s. So it's been a very, very slow process. But I do see reason to be hopeful. And one reason I see room for hope is that medical education is changing. So I talked to doctors when I was writing this book who were not that old, who were in their 40s. And when they were doing their med school, their residency, all of their training, their entire education might have consisted of a single hour in which they were told to go to an AA meeting. And that's changing. So now every student who takes the boards are questioned on the FDA-approved drugs for treating alcohol use disorder. There are off-label drugs that are really interesting, things like Ozempic. So I think we're moving in that right direction. But I talk to people who've been trying to spread the word about Sinclair Method and naltrexone for at this point 15 years, and it's still really unknown. I'd hope that my book would maybe help move the needle on this, but I don't think
Not yet.
Maybe next year.
Not yet. What advice would you give to someone who is listening to this and they're thinking about, either for themselves, maybe even for someone they know, about thinking about quitting drinking, thinking about, maybe suggesting to someone in their life who could use this?
So the first thing I would say is that people in AA, sober people, are not lying when they say that life is better sober. I am as shocked as anyone to report this, but you can still have a good time sober. I actually go to parties, not that often, but every once in a while, I go to parties sober. Went to a lovely dinner party at your house. I enjoyed it. I did not need to drink. I didn't. And I'm really shocked to report that that's actually true. There is a lot to look forward to in a life without alcohol addiction. The freedom that comes with having that monkey on your back is, I almost get emotional talking about it. I don't, but I almost do. It is a life-changing experience. So that's the first thing I would say. And then in terms of getting more, just get information. Read my book. There are Facebook groups. There are organizations that are devoted to helping people in this position. Arm yourself with information. That will make this process a lot easier.
It gives you the option to quit drinking, and that's valuable. So to wrap things up, I'm going to ask you the same question that we ask all of our guests at the end of this podcast, which is, what makes you optimistic about the future, about America, about society?
Okay, so there's a lot of talk about the housing crisis.
Yeah.
I don't think people have picked up on this. The first wave of baby boomers are turning 80 this year. I know this because my dad was in the first wave, born in 1946.
Really? Literally?
Yes. So he's turning 80 this year. In great health, but he won't always be. We're about to have a large decline in the population of elderly people. The housing crisis, we don't need to build, folks. The housing crisis is going to solve itself on its own. It's
okay, you are going anti-message on this podcast, but I will allow it because you are charming in person at dinner parties, and also because it was a great book and it's a great cause, and you have made me more optimistic about the future. Anyway, Katie Herzog, thank you so much for being with us.
Good to see you, Megan. Thanks for having me.